I got back from Chicago after 2 weeks at my mother's bedside. When I arrived at the ranch on the outskirts of Austin, I heard desperate banging coming from the basement. I broke the padlock and found my wife. She was filthy, dehydrated, and confused. She had been locked in there for 14 days. When I asked her who had done this, she whispered, "James, our son, and Sarah, our daughter-in-law." In that moment, I swore I would make sure they got exactly what they deserved. There are moments that divide your life into two distinct halves, the before and the after. For me, that moment came at 62 years old, the image of Linda, my partner for 35 years, sitting on the floor of our basement, her clothes soiled, her eyes sunken from dehydration. It shattered the reality I thought I knew. I didn't scream, I didn't curse, I didn't run frantically looking for James. Instead, I felt a cold, calculating calm settle in my chest as I helped Linda up the stairs. I laid her in our bed and gave her water in small, controlled sips, remembering how dangerous it is to hydrate someone too quickly in her condition. My movements were precise, almost mechanical, while my mind worked with a clarity I hadn't felt in years. "It's okay," I whispered, gently cleaning her face with a damp towel. "You're safe now. I'll take care of everything." As she finally drifted into a restless sleep, I sat in the rocking chair by the window, looking out at the vineyards that stretched as far as the eye could see. Our vineyards, the fruit of decades of work. The inheritance I once thought I would proudly leave to James, our only son. Not anymore. My name is Henry Mason. I was born in a small town in West Texas you've probably never heard of. I was the son of a rural schoolteacher and a seamstress who could barely sign her own name. From childhood, I understood that education was my only way out of poverty. I studied with a determination that surprised even my father, who valued books above all material possessions. I earned a scholarship to the University of Texas thanks to my flawless grades, and there I studied agricultural engineering, working simultaneously as a night shift waiter to cover expenses the scholarship didn't. Those were years of absolute sacrifice. I slept 4 hours a night, ate once a day, and never allowed myself the luxury of a beer with friends or a trip to the movies. Every dollar saved brought me closer to my goal: financial independence, and a future where no one in my family would ever go hungry again. It was during my senior year of college that I met Linda Wallace. She was a brilliant biochemistry student researching organic fertilizers. We met at a sustainable agriculture conference, where I was presenting a modest paper on irrigation systems for semi-arid areas. Linda, with her sharp intelligence and a laugh that seemed to light up any room, fascinated me from our very first conversation. Our courtship was brief but intense. We shared not only a personal attraction, but a common vision for American agriculture. We firmly believed it was possible to develop farming systems that were simultaneously profitable, sustainable, and socially responsible. This was at a time when most of the industry was focused exclusively on maximizing short-term profits. We got married a year after graduating, combining our modest savings to acquire 50 acres of land on the outskirts of Austin. The property was practically abandoned, with soil degraded by decades of bad farming practices. The locals thought we had made a terrible investment, but Linda and I saw potential where others only saw barren land. The first few years were extremely difficult. We lived in a small adobe house that we repaired with our own hands. We worked from sunrise until well into the night, implementing soil regeneration techniques that Linda had studied in theory, but had never been applied on a commercial scale in the U.S. Every penny we earned was reinvested into the property. Water collection systems, composting, essential equipment. While neighboring farmers watched us with skepticism, we gradually transformed that abandoned land. By the 5th year, our organic crops were starting to show promising results. By the 10th, Mason Regenerative Farms was regionally recognized as a pioneer in commercially viable regenerative agriculture. James, our only son, was born in the midst of this transformation. Linda had complications during childbirth that almost cost both of them their lives. The doctors informed us we couldn't have any more children. This devastated us at first, but we eventually accepted it, concentrating all our love on the little boy we had. We raised James among experimental crops and makeshift labs. From a young age, he showed exceptional intelligence and an insatiable curiosity. At 10, he already understood concepts of soil microbiology that Linda taught him with infinite patience. We gave him the best education possible: private schools in Austin, specialized tutors, international educational trips when our resources began to allow it. Every sacrifice seemed justified to give him the opportunities we never had. Meanwhile, our company grew consistently. We developed our own farming techniques, which we eventually patented. We expanded operations to adjacent lands that we gradually acquired. Our premium organic products found a market among high-income consumers, first in Texas, and then internationally. At 16, James told us he wanted to study business administration instead of agronomy or science. Although I was initially disappointed, I had imagined he would continue Linda's scientific legacy. We respected his decision. The company will need both technical innovation and strategic management to grow to the next level, Linda argued with her usual balanced view. We funded his studies at a prestigious university in Houston, followed by a master's in international business in Barcelona. During those years abroad, our communication gradually became less frequent and more superficial. We attributed it to the physical distance, to his natural process of becoming independent, to the inevitable generational differences. It was in Barcelona that James met Sarah Mendez. She was the daughter of a Spanish hotel businessman with significant interests in the U.S. Beautiful, sophisticated, educated in the best European institutions. Sarah seemed to perfectly complement our ambitious son. When James announced their engagement, just 6 months after meeting her, we were surprised by the speed of the decision, but we were happy for his apparent happiness. The wedding, held at an exclusive estate in Napa Valley, was considerably more ostentatious than we would have preferred. It's an investment in strategic relationships, James explained when I expressed concern about the exorbitant expenses. The contacts we'll make during this event will open doors that no marketing strategy ever could. As a wedding gift, we transferred 25% of the shares of Mason Regenerative Farms to James. We also gave them the deed to a house in Austin that we had bought as an investment years earlier. So, you can have financial independence, but also roots near us, Linda explained during the emotional gift-giving. The first signs of trouble appeared gradually after their return to Texas and their formal incorporation into the family business. James, now with the title of Director of Strategy and Expansion, began to implement changes. At first, they seemed like necessary modernizations, but they gradually revealed fundamental differences in vision. He proposed abandoning some of our most expensive sustainable practices in favor of cheaper, conventional methods. He insisted on reducing crop diversity to focus on high-margin products. He hired executives from traditional agribusiness corporations, the very model we had always criticized. When we expressed concerns, he assured us they were temporary strategic adjustments to strengthen our financial position before reinvesting in sustainability on a larger scale. Sarah, meanwhile, took on a prominent social role in Austin. She organized exclusive events at our property, established connections with influential figures, gradually transforming the public perception of Mason Regenerative Farms from a sustainable family business to a sophisticated corporation with global aspirations. The tension in the family grew subtly. Discussions that started as technical debates often ended in arguments about fundamental values. Linda and I felt gradually marginalized in the decision-making of the company we had built from scratch. James, constantly backed by Sarah, treated us more and more like visionary founders whose time of active leadership had passed. It's the natural cycle of generations, Linda would remind me when I expressed frustration. We have to trust that the values we instilled in him will eventually balance out his ambition. 3 years after the wedding, when James already effectively controlled 40% of the company, after cleverly negotiating an expansion of his stake, I received the call that would change our lives forever. My younger sister, Lucy, contacted me from Chicago with disturbing news. Our mother, who at 87 had maintained relatively good health, had suffered a significant stroke. As the eldest of 3 siblings and the only one with relative work flexibility, thanks ironically to my growing marginalization in my own company, I decided to travel to Chicago immediately. Linda, in the middle of a crucial research project on degraded soil regeneration, couldn't accompany me right away. "I'll travel as soon as I stabilize the experiment," she promised as she hurriedly packed my suitcase, probably in 3 or 4 days. "In the meantime, I'll be in constant contact." The farewell was rushed but affectionate. James and Sarah were in New York City for an agribusiness conference, so I couldn't inform them personally, but I left them a detailed message explaining the situation and my immediate departure. Linda promised to contact them and coordinate any necessary support during my absence. The next 2 weeks were a blur of hospital corridors, medical consultations, difficult decisions, and nights of interrupted sleep in an uncomfortable chair by my mother's bedside. Her condition fluctuated. Days of apparent improvement were followed by worrying setbacks. The doctors maintained cautious optimism about her eventual recovery, but emphasized the importance of patience and constant care. The most disconcerting thing during that period was the increasingly erratic communication with Linda. The first few days, we spoke several times daily, sharing updates about my mother and the situation at the ranch. She mentioned that James and Sarah had returned from New York City and were being surprisingly attentive, helping with operational matters while she finished her experiment. After the 5th day, our communications began to space out. Her messages, once detailed and emotional, became brief and vague. Calls that used to last 30 minutes were reduced to 2-minute conversations, where she seemed hurried, almost nervous. When I expressed concern, she assured me she was just extremely busy coordinating everything in my absence. By the 10th day, the calls had stopped completely. I only received occasional text messages, always brief. "Everything fine here. Focus on your mother. Don't worry about us. I'm handling the situation. James and Sarah are being very helpful." I tried contacting James directly, but only received equally curt responses. "Mom is busy with the project." "But fine. She's keeping you updated, right? Focus on Grandma. We have everything under control here." A growing unease began to form inside me, amplified by the stress of the situation with my mother and the accumulated physical exhaustion. Something wasn't right with the communications, but I couldn't pinpoint exactly what was bothering me so much. The opportunity to return to Austin came unexpectedly when my older brother arrived. "Go home for a couple of days," he insisted. "Get some proper rest. Solve whatever you need to solve, and come back. I'll stay with Mom in the meantime." The journey back was a torture of growing anxiety. I called Linda repeatedly during the trip, with no answer. The messages I sent were left unread. Calls to James went straight to voicemail. I even tried contacting some trusted employees, only receiving vague answers like, "Mrs. Linda is working in the lab," or "Mr. James mentioned you would be back next week." When the taxi finally dropped me off at the main entrance of the ranch, it was already getting dark. The property seemed strangely silent for a time when there would normally be considerable activity. The main house had few lights on. Linda's car was not in its usual spot, although James's truck was parked near the guest house, where he and Sarah were staying temporarily while renovating their own house. I went in using my key, calling for Linda immediately. The silence that greeted my calls intensified my unease. I systematically searched the ground floor, kitchen, living room, dining room, study. Linda's small home lab. Everything seemed in order. No obvious signs of problems, but no signs of recent presence either. I was about to go upstairs when I heard it, a faint rhythmic sound, like muffled banging, coming from the east wing of the house, where the storage room and the basement access were located. It was a space we rarely used, except for storing old equipment and physical company files. I followed the sound, which grew clearer as I approached the heavy wooden door that led to the basement. A chill ran down my spine when I noticed the new, sturdy padlock securing the door. A padlock that definitely wasn't there when I left for Chicago. "Linda," I called out, getting closer to the door. "Are you down there?" The banging immediately intensified, now accompanied by a muffled sound that might have been a voice trying to answer through the thick wood. Without hesitating another second, I frantically looked for a tool to break the padlock. I found a crowbar in the nearby garden shed and, with strength fueled by panic and adrenaline. I managed to break the mechanism after several desperate attempts. The darkness of the basement was almost complete, except for a faint light filtering through a small window near the ceiling. As my eyes adjusted, I distinguished a figure sitting against the opposite wall. Linda, my Linda, in conditions I could never have imagined possible. Her normally immaculate hair was tangled and dirty. Her clothes, the same ones she was wearing the day I left, showed stains and signs of being worn continuously. A plastic bucket in the corner revealed the degrading conditions she had been forced to live in. A nearly empty water bottle and some energy bar wrappers suggested the minimal nutrition she had received. Henry. Her voice was barely a hoarse whisper as she looked up at me, squinting at the sudden light from the hallway. I knew you would come. Eventually, I carried her carefully up the stairs. Every step confirmed my worst nightmare as I noted her extreme weakness, her obvious dehydration, the constant tremor in her hands. As I attended to her in our room, providing basic hydration and food, she managed to articulate fragments of what had happened. The day after I left, James and Sarah had returned unexpectedly from New York City. They visited the lab where Linda was working, apparently interested in her research. Sarah offered her a tea that, she now understood, contained some kind of sedative. When she woke up, she was already in the basement, confused and disoriented. During the first few days, James came down regularly, explaining that this was temporary and necessary while they finalized certain business adjustments. He assured her that I was aware of it and had agreed to a necessary restructuring of the company. He allowed her to use her phone briefly to send controlled messages, threatening to worsen her conditions if she tried to alert me. Gradually, the visits became less frequent. The information dwindled. When she tried to resist or demand explanations, she was met with a calculating coldness in our son that she had never witnessed before. "This is just business, Mom," he had told her on his last visit 3 days ago. "You and Dad created something valuable, but you got stuck in impractical idealism. The market demands efficiency and returns, not sentimentality about sustainability." "Why?" I asked. The most basic and painful question. Why would our own son do something like this? Linda, lying back against the pillows, her eyes reflecting a mix of physical pain and emotional devastation, answered with a clarity that surprised me given her condition. The documents on my desk. I was reviewing accounting anomalies I accidentally found. Massive transfers, strange contracts, with corporations I didn't recognize. Shutdowns of our most sustainable but less profitable operations. She paused, breathing heavily. "I think they've been systematically emptying the company for months, preparing for something big, and my discovery threatened whatever plan they had." "What plan?" I insisted, trying to understand the magnitude of the betrayal. "I'm not completely sure," she admitted, "but I heard fragments of conversations. James talking to someone about finalizing the acquisition, transfer of intellectual assets, elimination of redundant operations. Henry." Her voice broke slightly. "I think they are selling Mason Regenerative Farms to some international conglomerate, not as a strategic alliance, but as a complete absorption." The rage that had been building inside me since I found the padlock threatened to explode. Selling the company we had built with decades of sacrifice, dismantling the sustainable model that was our core legacy, and holding Linda prisoner to prevent her interference. "Where are they now?" I asked. My voice surprisingly controlled considering the storm inside. "They mentioned a trip to New York City today, an important meeting with the buyers. They should be back tomorrow, from what I managed to overhear." As Linda finally gave in to exhaustion and fell asleep, I sat by the window, watching the night fall completely over the ranch. This place, which represented not just a financial investment, but our life's project, our contribution to the world. Our values materialized in crops and processes. The betrayal by James and Sarah was absolute, not just corporate, but deeply personal. They had attacked Linda's safety and dignity. They had manipulated our trust. They had conspired to dismantle everything we valued, all while I was vulnerably distant attending to my sick mother. The decision crystallized in my mind with surprising clarity. This would not stand. James and Sarah would discover that they had gravely underestimated the man they thought was an old, easily manipulated idealist. They would pay for every hour Linda spent in that basement, for every value they tried to destroy, for every fragment of family trust they had irreparably shattered. It wouldn't be an impulsive reaction. It wouldn't be blind revenge. It would be a calculated, precise, and definitive response. Because if I had learned anything in my decades of building a company from scratch, it was the importance of meticulous planning and flawless execution. As the moon rose over the vineyards that represented years of patient innovation, I began to mentally formulate my strategy. James and Sarah would return tomorrow, expecting to find Linda still captive and me still in Chicago, ignorant of everything. Instead, they would find a man perfectly prepared to ensure they received exactly what they deserved. And what they deserved, I decided as I watched the night shadows spread over the property they intended to snatch from us, was a lesson they would never forget. At 5 in the morning, I was already up. After just a few hours of intermittent sleep, Linda was still asleep, her breathing now more regular, her face gradually regaining some of the color the dehydration had stolen. I left her a note by the bed saying I would be back soon and quietly left the room. My first task was exhaustive documentation, with forensic meticulousness. I photographed the basement, the broken padlock, the makeshift bucket toilet, the meager food scraps, the marks on the wall where Linda had apparently kept track of the days. These images wouldn't just be legal evidence, but a permanent reminder of what James and Sarah were capable of. Then I went to Linda's desk in her lab, just as she had mentioned. I found open folders with financial documents showing highly suspicious patterns, substantial transfers to unknown entities, preliminary contracts with international agribusiness corporations, drastic budget cuts to sustainability programs. As I examined these documents, a devastating reality crystallized. James wasn't just selling the company. He was specifically selling the parts that represented our most innovative and valuable work. The biofertilizer patents Linda had developed over decades, the soil regeneration methods we had perfected with years of experimentation, the efficient irrigation techniques that had revolutionized farming in semi-arid areas. Everything was set to be transferred to a conglomerate called AgroCorp International, a multinational notorious for acquiring sustainable technologies only to implement them in diluted versions, maximizing short-term profits without the ethical commitment that originally inspired them. Even more disturbing was finding a document titled Parental Contingencies. In it, James detailed strategies for handling resistance from Linda and me. Options escalated from incentivized retirement to reassignment to symbolic roles with no real authority. The forced confinement didn't appear explicitly, but the clinical coldness of the document made it clear that any obstacle would be eliminated by any means necessary. With this information secured, I implemented the second phase of my plan: strategic contacts. I first called Raymond Allen, our corporate lawyer, for over 20 years, a man whose loyalty was based not only on a professional relationship, but on shared values. "Mr. Mason," he answered, surprised by my early call. "I thought you were still in Chicago. How is your mother?" "My mother is stable, Ray. I returned briefly for an urgent situation here. I need to see you immediately, in private, and with absolute discretion." Something in my tone must have communicated the gravity, because he replied without hesitation, "I'll be at the ranch in an hour." My second call was to Michael Sullivan, a retired police captain we occasionally hired for security at special events. Mike wasn't just a competent professional. He was a man of inflexible principles, something increasingly rare these days. "I need your services immediately," I explained briefly. "Delicate family situation with potential legal implications. Absolute discretion required." "Understood, Mr. Mason. How many men do you need?" 3. Reliable and discreet. Immediate setup, continuous supervision, and potential implementation of containment protocols if necessary, while waiting for their arrivals. I selectively called 5 key executives at Mason Regenerative Farms, people who had grown up with the company and shared our original vision. Luke Wagner, Director of Operations. Beatrice Olson, Head of Applied Research; Frank Madison, responsible for Associated Producer Relations; Diana Towers, Chief Financial Officer; and Jason Rogers, our Head of International Logistics. The conversations were brief, but effective. Urgent meeting at my house at 9 a.m. sharp. Maximum discretion. Do not mention this to anyone, especially not to James or any recently hired staff. By the time I returned to our room with a light breakfast for Linda, she was already awake, sitting up against the pillows, visibly stronger, though still marked by the experience. "You're implementing countermeasures," she observed immediately. Always perceptive, even in extreme circumstances. "That's right," I confirmed, placing the tray on her lap. "Do you feel strong enough to participate in some meetings today?" "You're not excluding me from this, Henry," she replied with quiet determination. "I need to be part of whatever decisions we make." "I would never consider excluding you," I replied, taking her hand. "I'm just worried about your physical recovery. I'll be fine." "Outrage provides surprising energy," she added, with a faint but genuine smile, the first glimpse of the indomitable spirit I had always admired in her. Raymond Allen arrived promptly, his expression transforming from professional concern to absolute indignation as we explained the situation, showing him the evidence I had gathered. "This transcends family conflict or business disagreement," he ruled after meticulously reviewing the documentation. "The forced confinement constitutes a prosecutable crime. The irregular financial transfers suggest potential embezzlement. And the preliminary contracts with AgroCorp possibly violate fundamental clauses in the corporate bylaws about protecting intellectual property. What do you recommend as the first step?" "Immediate implementation of corporate protection protocols," he replied without hesitating. "Fortunately, we had the foresight to establish emergency mechanisms when you granted James his initial stake. We can temporarily freeze any major transactions, suspend financial authorizations, and require unanimous approval from the Founding Council for any negotiation with external entities." "How long would it take to implement this?" I asked, aware of the limited time available. "With your immediate authorization, I can have everything legally activated by this afternoon. Formal notifications will reach all involved parties, including AgroCorp, before the end of the day." "Proceed," Linda and I authorized simultaneously. As Ray left to initiate the legal procedures, Mike Sullivan arrived with his team, 3 discreet but obviously experienced men, dressed as common farm workers, so as not to alert neighbors or regular employees to their true function. "Perimeter secured," Mike reported after a quick inspection of the property. "We've established observation points with visual line of sight to all main entrances and the guest house. Encrypted radio communication. Intervention protocol established if necessary." "Perfect," I nodded. "The absolute priority is Mrs. Linda's safety. Secondarily, full monitoring of movements on the property, especially when James and Sarah return, likely this afternoon." "Are you expecting physical resistance?" he asked with neutral professionalism. "Unlikely, but not impossible. James has no history of violence, but his recent actions demonstrate a capacity for behavior I would never have considered possible." "Understood. We'll be prepared for any scenario without unnecessary escalation." At 9 o'clock sharp, the 5 convened executives arrived discreetly, their expressions mixing concern and curiosity. Linda's presence, visibly weakened but determined to participate, immediately intensified the seriousness of the meeting. "Thank you for coming on such short notice," I began. "What we are about to share is extremely sensitive, but we need your support to protect not only the company, but the fundamental values that have defined Mason Regenerative Farms since its conception." Over the next hour, we systematically presented the full situation. Linda's confinement, the secret negotiations with AgroCorp, the irregular financial transfers, the plans to gradually dismantle our sustainable model in favor of purely extractive commercialization. Their reactions visibly transitioned from initial disbelief to collective outrage, culminating in a shared resolve to protect the legacy they all had helped build. "This explains recent changes that seemed inexplicable," commented Luke, our operations director. "Sudden cancellations of profitable long-term community programs, pressure to adopt more conventional methods on experimental farms. James justified everything as necessary operational optimization. The financial transfers had worried me for months, added Diana, our CFO. But when I questioned certain movements, James presented seemingly legitimate authorizations, signed during his time as interim director while you were at international conferences. Signatures they likely obtained by slipping documents into piles of routine paperwork, Linda observed with bitterness. We need your support to implement an immediate containment plan, I explained, presenting the strategy developed with Ray. We will regain full operational control, freeze external negotiations, and establish mechanisms to prevent this from happening again. You have my absolute support, Beatrice responded immediately, followed by equally firm confirmations from the others. Many of us noticed the gradual drift from our founding principles and were deeply concerned. With this loyal team confirmed, we proceeded to systematically implement each phase of the corporate recovery plan, exhaustive review of recent transactions, inventory of potentially compromised intellectual assets, controlled communication with strategic partners to clarify that any prior negotiation with James required formal revalidation. By mid-afternoon, when Ray confirmed that the legal notifications had been formally issued, we had a complete picture of the operation James had been orchestrating. A majority sale to AgroCorp, with specific clauses to gradually eliminate economically inefficient components of our model, precisely those social and environmental aspects we considered fundamental. He planned to temporarily maintain the Mason Regenerative Farms brand for its reputational value, until eventually absorbing it completely. It's brilliant. In its calculated destruction, Linda commented, as we reviewed the documents in our study, extracting maximum economic value, while systematically eliminating the very components that make our model genuinely revolutionary. A complete perversion of everything we tried to build. And he would have succeeded if you hadn't accidentally discovered his financial movements, I added, again astonished at how meticulously the entire operation had been planned. What I can't fully understand is how our James, the boy we raised with so much emphasis on fundamental values, could transform into someone capable of this, Linda reflected, expressing the question that continually tormented our minds. Sarah's influence seems significant, I observed. The structure and language of these strategic documents have distinctive features of international corporate training that James never received. But no one can be completely manipulated without an internal predisposition, Linda replied with the painful honesty that always characterized her. Something in James responded to this mercantilist view of the world. Perhaps it was always latent, and we, in our parental hope, refused to recognize it. Our conversation was interrupted by Mike's discreet alert over the radio. Main subjects approaching. Black vehicle entering through the main access. James and Sarah had returned. Are you ready for this? I asked Linda, aware that the imminent confrontation would be emotionally devastating, especially given her still vulnerable physical state. Absolutely, she replied with serene firmness. I need to look them directly in the eye while they explain how they could ethically justify keeping me prisoner in subhuman conditions. Mike and one of his men took discreet but strategic positions as we waited in the main living room. The sound of the door opening was followed by low conversation that ceased abruptly when James and Sarah entered the room and found us waiting for them. The shock on their faces was momentarily genuine and complete. James visibly paled while Sarah, recovering more quickly, composed her expression into professional neutrality, although the tension in her posture was unmistakable. "Dad!" James finally exclaimed, trying to project normalcy although his voice betrayed obvious nervousness. "We didn't expect you back so soon. How's Grandma?" My son's ability to stand in front of us, faking absolute normality, as if he hadn't kept his mother prisoner for 2 weeks, hit me on a visceral level. It was like looking at a complete stranger wearing my son's familiar face. "James," I replied with controlled calm, "I believe we have an extremely important conversation pending." His eyes darted nervously toward Linda, fully registering her presence and condition for the first time. "Mom," he greeted cautiously, "you look unwell. Problems with the project?" "No, James," Linda replied with devastating tranquility. "Problems with being held prisoner in our own basement for 14 days. By my own son. The silence that followed was absolute. The pretense of normalcy completely disintegrated as James realized the situation was irrevocably exposed. It was a necessary temporary measure, Sarah intervened, her accent slightly more pronounced under stress. A strategic containment while we finalized critical negotiations that could not be interrupted by emotional interference. Strategic containment? Linda repeated, her indignation perfectly controlled, but palpable. An interesting euphemism for kidnapping and criminal negligence. James, regaining partial composure, tried to redirect the conversation toward more defensible territory. I understand that from a certain perspective. Our actions seem extreme, but the business context required decisive measures to ensure long-term competitive survival. Competitive survival? I questioned, keeping my tone deliberately neutral. Or maximization of personal commissions in a corporate sale structured to primarily benefit you too, while systematically destroying the sustainable model that defines our company? His expression revealed momentary surprise at our detailed knowledge. I see you've reviewed preliminary documentation out of context, he replied, smoothly transitioning to professional defense mode. Those documents represent exploratory scenarios, not finalized decisions. Scenarios that coincidentally required keeping your mother isolated and incommunicado for 2 weeks while I was conveniently absent, I observed. A curious coincidence. Exceptional circumstances require exceptional measures, Sarah intervened again, maintaining remarkable professional coldness. The opportunity with AgroCorp represents unprecedented valuation for currently sub-optimized assets. Assets that include patents developed specifically for ethical and sustainable implementation, not for commercial extraction detached from social responsibility, Linda replied. Intellectual property explicitly protected against precisely this type of commercialization in our founding bylaws. James sighed theatrically, like a patient teacher explaining basic concepts to particularly dense students. The world has evolved beyond simplistic dichotomies between sustainability and profitability, Mom. AgroCorp offers a global platform for scalable implementation of innovations currently limited by self-imposed operational restrictions. Restrictions you call self-imposed, and we call fundamental integrity, I replied. Non-negotiable values that have defined this company since its conception. Values that the market simply doesn't reward proportionally, Sarah argued, her tone combining barely veiled condescension with aggressive pragmatism. The structured transaction values Mason Regenerative Farms at figures it would never reach under the current operating model. And how much of that valuation would conveniently disappear into structural commissions and transition bonuses for you two? Standard compensation for key facilitators in transactions of this magnitude, James replied finally, completely aligned with accepted industry practices. While you held your mother prisoner to prevent any interference in said accepted practices, I concluded, finally allowing some of my controlled indignation into my voice. James at least had the decency to show momentary discomfort at this direct accusation. It was an extremely difficult decision, implemented under exceptional pressure, he conceded reluctantly. Not initially imagined, but eventually considered necessary given the critical time parameters. Parameters that are now facing significant complications, I informed him, reaching for the envelope containing the newly received legal notifications. While you were finalizing details in New York City, we were implementing corporate protection protocols established precisely for situations like this. I handed them the notifications, watching as their expressions transitioned from initial confusion to horrified understanding of the implications. Complete freeze of corporate assets, temporary suspension of executive authorizations, requirement of unanimous approval from the Founding Council for any external negotiation, formal notification to AgroCorp of irregularities in the negotiation process. This is completely unacceptable, James stammered, his professional facade disintegrating at the catastrophic implications for his meticulously organized plans. You can't just unilaterally reverse months of critical strategic negotiations. In the same way that you couldn't just lock your mother in a basement, I replied with relentless calm. Extreme actions generate proportional consequences. AgroCorp has already committed significant resources based on explicit guarantees, Sarah intervened, her calculated composure visibly fractured. There are potentially devastating legal implications for malicious interference in advanced negotiations. Negotiations founded on fraudulent representation of executive authority, Linda corrected, according to explicit confirmation from our corporate lawyers. Any preliminary agreement established under these circumstances is inherently invalid. James looked at us alternately, his expression oscillating between indignation, panic, and a frantic calculation of remaining options. "You are making a catastrophic mistake," he warned, trying to regain a negotiating position. This opportunity represented unprecedented international expansion for innovations currently restricted to limited regional implementation. "The only catastrophic mistake here," I replied, with absolute firmness, "was your decision to betray not only fundamental business principles, but basic human values. You locked up your own mother, James, the person who gave you life, who sacrificed her own professional opportunities to raise you, who always defended your decisions, even when I expressed reservations. For the first time, something resembling genuine shame seemed to pierce the armor of rationalization James had built. A momentary flash of authentic recognition of the moral magnitude of his transgression. Sarah, dangerously perceiving this crack in their shared determination, intervened strategically. "I understand the justified indignation at imperfectly implemented methods. I propose a reflective pause to identify a resolution that preserves the strategic opportunity while addressing specific ethical concerns." "There is no available resolution that preserves this supposed strategic opportunity," Linda replied with quiet firmness. "Some lines, once crossed, permanently transform the relational terrain upon which we could negotiate." James, regaining his posture, adopted a more directly confrontational stance. "What exactly do you intend to achieve with this? Complete destruction of corporate valuation? Cancellation of an international expansion opportunity? A return to a regionally limited operation based on commercially suboptimal idealism? We intend to implement appropriate consequences for indefensible actions," I replied simply, "in both the business and family spheres." "Consequences like what?" he challenged, his tone mixing belligerence with defensive calculation. "Like these," I replied, "extracting the second set of prepared documents, complete suspension of all executive authority, effective immediately, an exhaustive forensic investigation of all financial transactions executed during the last 6 months, a formal assessment of potential legal violations, including but not limited to forced confinement, corporate fraud, and fiduciary malfeasance." Their faces visibly paled as they understood the full magnitude of our response. "And finally," I added, handing over the final document, "formal notification of immediate termination of residency in corporate properties. You have exactly 24 hours to completely vacate the guest house." "You can't kick us out of our own house," James exclaimed, genuinely shocked by this unexpected development. "The property is registered in the name of Mason Regenerative Farms." "Not personally to you," Linda corrected with inflexible precision. "Your occupancy was always conditioned on active executive affiliation, which is now formally suspended." Sarah, quickly assessing the full implications, adopted a more pragmatically negotiating approach. "Surely there must be a possibility of a less adversarial resolution. Modified terms that allow for a dignified transition while preserving viable elements of the proposed restructuring. The only transition currently available," I replied calmly, "is your orderly departure from corporate property while we implement additional proportional consequences for your documented actions. The full magnitude of these consequences will depend, in part, on your immediate conduct." James stared at us, momentarily silenced by the gradual understanding of how completely he had underestimated our capacity for a decisive response. When he finally spoke, his voice mixed reluctant resignation with a barely veiled threat. "This isn't over. The company is partially mine by legal right. AgroCorp has significant international legal resources, and you aren't exactly young enough to face prolonged corporate battles. An age that didn't prevent us from completely dismantling your elaborate conspiracy in less than 24 hours, Linda observed with devastating tranquility. Experience has certain advantages that impatient ambition often underestimates. With that deeply accurate observation, our initial confrontation concluded. James and Sarah retreated toward the guest house, exchanging looks that clearly indicated the immediate formulation of defensive countermeasures. "This is just beginning," Linda commented as we watched them leave from the window. "They will try to regain control by any means available. And they will discover that we are absolutely prepared for any scenario," I replied, taking her hand gently. James always underestimated our determination, because he mistook our principles as merely ideological, rather than fundamentally practical. As the sun began to set over the vineyards, I felt a strange combination of iron resolution and deep melancholy. The battle we faced wouldn't just be for corporate control, but for the very definition of what values would prevail in the legacy we had meticulously built over a lifetime. "They will receive exactly what they deserve," I murmured, more to myself than to Linda. "What is deserved is rarely what is desired," she replied, with that quiet wisdom that had always been her most notable characteristic. "But it is, frequently, precisely what is necessary." The following days unfolded with the calculated intensity of a chess match where every move had been meticulously anticipated. James and Sarah, as we expected, immediately implemented desperate countermeasures. Their first move was legal. They hired Blackwell and Partners, one of the most prestigious and aggressive corporate law firms in New York City. The legal notices began to arrive, challenges to the asset freeze, questions about the legitimacy of the founding council to revoke previously granted authorizations, barely veiled threats of extensive litigation. Ray, our lawyer, received this avalanche with experienced serenity. "Standard intimidation," he explained during our morning meeting. "They're looking to generate enough pressure to force a negotiation from a weakened position. The legal foundations of our actions are absolutely solid." Simultaneously, James attempted an internal delegitimization campaign. He selectively contacted key executives and employees, presenting a carefully edited narrative where he appeared as a visionary innovator, unfairly marginalized by old-fashioned founders. This strategy failed spectacularly when he discovered we had already implemented transparent communication with the entire organization. We didn't reveal the most personally painful details, Linda's confinement, but we did openly share the documentation about the planned secret sale and the program dismantling of the sustainable model that defined our company. "The staff's response has been overwhelmingly supportive," Beatrice reported during our executive meeting on the third day. "Many expressed that they had sensed the gradual drift from our core principles and were deeply concerned." When these approaches failed, James and Sarah escalated to more aggressive tactics. They tried to access corporate servers remotely, an access that had been preemptively blocked by our technical team. They directly contacted strategic clients with distorted information about transitory instability, which was neutralized by our proactive communications. They even tried, through intermediaries, to approach my mother in the hospital in Chicago, apparently looking for some form of additional emotional pressure, which was prevented thanks to the surveillance we had implemented. On the fourth day, while I was personally supervising the forensic audit of recent financial transactions, I received the call I had secretly been expecting. Mr. Mason, the voice of John Rivers, Director of Corporate Development for AgroCorp International, sounded tense and calculatedly neutral. "I regret contacting you under these complex circumstances. Would it be possible to arrange a private conversation?" "Of course," I replied with professional cordiality, "although I must inform you that any substantive discussion will require the presence of appropriate legal representation." "Understandable," he conceded, however, before escalating to fully formalized interactions. I thought a frank exchange about the current situation would be prudent. The meeting was set for that afternoon at a discreet restaurant on the outskirts of Austin. John Rivers turned out to be exactly as I had imagined. Impeccably presented, perfectly polite, and calculatingly pragmatic. "I'll be direct," he began, after minimal cordial exchanges. "AgroCorp has invested significant resources in negotiations that were apparently conducted without legitimate authorization, an unfortunate situation for all parties involved. Particularly unfortunate that any due diligence would have revealed explicit limitations on James's executive authority, I replied calmly. Limitations documented in publicly accessible corporate records. Rivers had the decency to show momentary discomfort. Evidently, suboptimal verification processes will be reevaluated internally, he conceded. However, the immediate question is how to proceed constructively from this position. That depends entirely on your expectations, I replied. If you are looking to complete the acquisition under the parameters originally discussed, I must inform you that such a scenario is categorically impossible, regardless of specific legal considerations. Impossible due to philosophical considerations regarding corporate agribusiness practices? He asked, trying to determine if our position was ideological or merely negotiational. Impossible because Mason Regenerative Farms is not fundamentally for sale, I clarified, and because the specific components that apparently motivated your interest, particularly the biofertilizer patents and soil regeneration methods, are explicitly protected against implementation detached from integral sustainable principles. Rivers carefully evaluated my response, clearly recalibrating his approach. AgroCorp has evolved considerably in its orientation toward genuine sustainability, he offered. Perhaps there is room for a structured collaboration that preserves methodological integrity while allowing for controlled scaling. Potential collaboration would be considered under appropriate parameters, I conceded. Acquisition or majority shareholder control? Definitely not. Our conversation continued in this tenor for about an hour. Rivers subtly exploring different configurations that could at least partially preserve the investment AgroCorp had already made, while I established absolutely clear boundaries on what we would consider acceptable. Finally, we reached the crucial point. James Mason and Sarah Mendez offered specific guarantees, now evidently unfounded, Rivers observed. AgroCorp naturally considers significant personal liability in this situation. Understandable, I replied neutrally. However, any resolution must completely separate corporate issues from private family matters. Rivers nodded slowly, perfectly grasping my implicit message. We would not use potential legal problems as a pressure tool in family conflicts, but neither would we allow family ties to interfere with appropriate corporate consequences. I will communicate your position to executive leadership, he concluded professionally. I would anticipate a formal approach to discuss potential avenues for limited collaboration, within the parameters now clarified. The next day, we received formal notification from AgroCorp, withdrawing completely from any negotiation previously initiated with James, citing fundamental irregularities in authorized representation and irreconcilable discrepancies in corporate strategic vision. This notification, distributed simultaneously to all involved parties, effectively dismantled the last significant component of James's elaborate plan, without international corporate backing and without internal executive authority. His negotiating position completely collapsed. That same afternoon, as Linda and I were reviewing reports from the forensic audit in the study, we received an unexpected request. James was asking for a private meeting. Without Sarah, without lawyers, on neutral ground. Should we accept? I asked Linda, whose physical recovery was progressing remarkably, although the emotional scars clearly remained. Yes, she replied after careful consideration, not out of naive hope for immediate reconciliation, but because eventually we will need to establish some kind of functional communication, even if it's strictly professional. The cafe selected for our meeting was on the outskirts of Austin, a discreet establishment frequented mainly by locals. James arrived alone, as promised. His appearance showed visible signs of sustained stress. His suit slightly wrinkled, prominent dark circles under his eyes, a certain nervous tension in his usually confident posture. "Thank you for agreeing to see me," he began after minimally cordial exchanges. "I recognize you have no obligation to listen to me considering recent circumstances." "We're listening," Linda replied simply, her tone neutral but not openly hostile. James took a deep breath, visibly organizing carefully prepared thoughts. "First, I want to express an unequivocal apology for the forced confinement. It was inexcusable, regardless of the justifications that seemed valid at the time of extreme stress, especially toward you, Mom." Linda nodded briefly. accepting this apology without offering complete absolution. Second, he continued, although I maintain that the current corporate structure significantly limits the expansive potential of our innovations, I recognize that the methods implemented to try to modify it were fundamentally inappropriate and potentially illegal. Potentially is considerable generosity, I observed dryly. Fair, he conceded with visible reluctance. Definitely illegal in several specific aspects. James seemed momentarily hesitant, as if debating internally how much more to reveal. Sarah and I have separated, he added finally. Temporarily, at least, possibly permanently. This unexpected revelation genuinely surprised us. Throughout the confrontation, they had projected an image of an unbreakable alliance. I'm sorry, Linda offered eventually, her natural empathy emerging despite the extraordinary circumstances. Fundamental disagreements on how to proceed after the complete collapse of our plans, he explained briefly, and a belated recognition that certain aspects of our relationship were fundamentally unbalanced from the beginning. We didn't press for additional details, but the implicit meaning was clear enough. The crisis had revealed problematic dynamics in their marriage that had possibly contributed to the questionable business decisions. What do you hope to achieve with this conversation? I asked directly. Clarity on what's next, he replied with surprising frankness. The legal agreements in process obviously eliminate my executive position entirely and severely restrict even my minority shareholder rights. I understand that consequences are inevitable. I am mainly seeking to understand if there is any path toward, not complete reconciliation, obviously, but at least functional coexistence eventually. Linda and I exchanged a brief glance, communicating silently as only couples with decades of deep connection can. Actions have irreversible consequences, James, I finally replied. Trust, once fundamentally broken, cannot simply be restored through apologies, regardless of how genuine they may be. I understand that, he nodded, his expression reflecting resignation rather than surprise. However, Linda continued, we share a fundamental biological bond that cannot simply be ignored, regardless of the circumstances. And eventually, possibly, some limited form of professional relationship could be developed, strictly defined and appropriately supervised. I don't expect more than that, he replied, momentarily dropping his facade to show a genuine vulnerability rarely seen in recent years. And I recognize that even that limited possibility represents considerable generosity, considering my actions. Our conversation continued briefly, carefully navigating neutral territories before concluding with a basic agreement. Strictly professional communication, through legal representatives regarding corporate matters, the possibility of extremely limited personal interaction after an appropriate period of complete separation. As we watched James walk away, his posture communicating a defeat and resignation I had never associated with my son, who was always confident to the point of arrogance, Linda expressed the thought that quietly occupied both our minds. Do you think we'll ever get back anything remotely close to a normal relationship with him? Not normal according to any traditional definition, I replied after careful consideration, but possibly some new form of interaction that acknowledges the transformed reality, fundamentally transformed by his choices. And by our responses to those choices, Linda added wisely. 6 months later, Mason Regenerative Farms has found a new equilibrium. The company, freed from the pressures toward extractive commercialization, has renewed its commitment to its original mission, new strategic collaborations with like-minded organizations, including, surprisingly, a newly developed, sustainable division at AgroCorp, have expanded our impact while maintaining our fundamental integrity. James, according to the finalized legal agreements, maintains a strictly passive minority stake, with no executive authority or operational presence. He relocated to Barcelona, apparently developing a consultancy, specializing in commercially viable sustainable agriculture, a direction that, ironically, might represent an eventual positive synthesis between the values we tried to instill in him and the mercantile perspective he developed independently. Our relationship with him remains formally cordial but emotionally distant. Communication is limited mainly to necessary professional exchanges, occasional basic personal updates, a mutual recognition that any form of more significant connection would require substantial evolution that might take years, if it happens at all. Sarah effectively disappeared from our lives, apparently returning to her family's operations in Spain, while maintaining complete distance from everything related to the U.S. and the events that occurred here this afternoon, as Linda and I quietly enjoy the sunset on the terrace. Observing the vineyards that represent decades of persistent vision and meticulous work, I reflect on the fundamental lessons learned during this transformative experience. "What are you thinking about so intensely?" Linda asks, always attentive to my contemplative moments. "About how the deepest crises reveal fundamental truths. About who we really are," I reply, "and how we must accept those revelations, regardless of how uncomfortable they may be." She nods, understanding precisely the direction of my thoughts, as she always has. James chose to prioritize profits over integrity in his defining moment. We chose to implement measured justice over impulsive revenge, and those choices defined our respective paths from that point, I add. Not with absolute determinism. There is always the possibility of redirection, but with inevitable consequences that must be navigated responsibly. We share a comfortable silence as the last rays of sun transform the distant clouds into an extraordinary chromatic spectacle. There is an inevitable melancholy in this moment. The family future we imagined for decades, working alongside our son, eventually transferring the business legacy and fundamental values to the next generation, has been irrevocably transformed. But there is also an authentic serenity that comes from having faced a defining crisis with consistent integrity and moral clarity. When I returned from Chicago and found Linda locked in that basement, I faced a fundamental choice: an impulsively destructive response, or measured, definitive action to restore balance and justice. I chose to ensure that James and Sarah received exactly what they deserved. Proportional consequences implemented with unwavering determination, but without unnecessary cruelty. That decision, though painful in its implementation, allowed us to maintain consistency with our fundamental values, even when facing absolute personal betrayal. "You know," Linda comments, as darkness gradually envelops the landscape. "Despite everything, I maintain a moderate hope for James, not a naive expectation of a miraculous transformation, but a recognition of the fundamental human capacity for significant evolution, even after catastrophic mistakes. I share that cautious optimism, I admit, not as a necessary condition for our current peace, but as a possibility that remains open as we continue on our own path with consistent integrity. The night has completely descended now, revealing familiar stars over the vineyards that represent the physical manifestation of the values we have consistently prioritized throughout our shared life. This place that we built together, that we almost lost to filial betrayal, that we reclaimed with quiet determination, continues to represent the tangible expression of a vision founded on unbreakable principles. "Let's go inside," Linda suggests eventually, rising with a serene dignity that not even the traumatic experience could permanently diminish. "Tomorrow we have an important presentation on expanding the training program for regional farmers." As we walk toward the house together, hand in hand as so many times over more than 3 decades of unbreakable alliance, I understand a crystal clear, essential truth. A truly valuable legacy does not reside primarily in material assets or commercial successes, but in the integrity with which we face fundamental challenges and the consistently implemented values that can potentially transcend even traumatic family ruptures. I returned from Chicago and found a world unrecognizably transformed by incomprehensible betrayal. I responded not with vindictive destruction, but with measured and proportional justice. And in that response, I preserved something infinitely more valuable than any company or material property: the fundamental dignity and moral coherence that constitute the only truly significant legacy we can leave. The door to genuine reconciliation remains slightly ajar, not with naive expectations, but with the realistic recognition that authentic human growth often emerges precisely from deserved consequences, implemented with unwavering firmness, but also with fundamental compassion. And in that possibility, improbable but not impossible, of eventual partial healing based on fully recognized truth, I find sufficient tranquility to conclude each day with gratitude for what was preserved, and moderate hope for what could potentially be rebuilt, even in a form inevitably different from what was originally imagined.